week, and we all remember the situation in the pandemic. It still goes on, I would argue, to this day. But long story short, I'm talking about the people in care homes and hospitals that were stopped from having contact with their loved ones during the period of the pandemic. Well, there's calls now under the guise of Gloria's Law, they're calling it, where residents and patients would have the right to always have at least one care supporter who could visit them in all circumstances, come what may. I think this is a great idea. I never want to see, I think it was very barbaric and cruel and inhumane, the policies that were enforced on these people in lockdown, and I would argue still continue to this day. I would support a law. Would you, James?
I'm sympathetic to the sentiment of the people pushing for it, but I wouldn't support it as law. I think it would be bad law because you can't know what the medical conditions are going to be. So let's say we had something like Ebola, where touch is extremely, it's extremely contagious, and then that person can give it to other people. I can see circumstances when, even though it's absolutely horrific, for perfectly reasonable medical reasons, you can't. So while I'm very sympathetic to it, and I think people not being able to see their loved ones, to say goodbye or to have somebody with them when they go is really, it's really horrific. But I think making a law which ties the hands, which basically says that there's no hypothetical medical example in the future which we can't predict, I think that's basically bad law.
Toby?
I think if we have an Ebola pandemic, protecting people in care homes from getting Ebola will be the least of our problems. No, I'm wholeheartedly behind this law. I think it's a great idea. It was absolutely inhumane to stop people visiting their loved ones, particularly when they were ill or dying in care homes during the pandemic. There's no evidence that actually protected people from getting COVID-19 in care homes. After all, the staff were walking in and out of care homes. If anyone was bringing it in, they were bringing it in. And I think there's another reason why this is a really important measure too, which is I'm absolutely convinced, and there's quite a lot of anecdotal evidence to suggest this is true, that one of the reasons for the high number of deaths in care homes during the pandemic, it wasn't just because older people were more vulnerable to COVID-19. It was because of neglect in care homes of older people. Many older people died of starvation and thirst, or of untreated other diseases. Why? Because their loved ones weren't coming in to check on them regularly and make sure they weren't being neglected. So for all sorts of really good reasons, I think this is a really sensible law.
Yeah, and one of the reasons I would want to see it in cast iron law is because, as we're seeing now with all of the so-called lockdown files and all the rest of it, so many of these rules and policies and all the rest of it, they were based on, in some cases, not a lot really, they were based on, I don't want to have an argument with Nicola Sturgeon, so yeah, let's mask all these kids. And so much of the so-called follow the science wasn't science at all. It was ridiculous. It was a science of ridiculousness, if anything. So I would say, if you protected people, you had this law, when you're then considering your options and your manoeuvres, if ever anything happened like this again, you would be mindful of, right, well, we have these things in law, therefore we have to follow them and all the rest of it. And I would say, what right as a care home or a nurse or anyone got to say, right, this person, you can't see your loved one? To me, that is complete overreach, state overreach.
Well, so I think it depends on how infectious and how the thing is infectious. And of course, we found out more over the course of the pandemic. We thought it transferred from touch and it was more contagious than it was at the beginning. And then we found out it's airborne and so on. But I can see the circumstance in which you'd say, these people are too vulnerable, no one from the outside can come in, because it's not just a risk to the loved one that I'm visiting, it might be to other people's loved ones who are there. So while I'm extremely sympathetic to the sentiment behind it, I understand why you both support it, but I think it sounds like a recipe for bad law. I think it's good to say we should err on the side of of stopping loneliness, of preventing people from being completely isolated in these, if we have these terrible times again. But to put it in a cast iron law, which then which then can't be responsive to what the situation is at the time, I think is the wrong response to that.
One of my viewers, Paul, you just give me an internal smile because he says, Michelle, I'm in my 80s and I currently live at home. If I ever have to go into a care home, then I want legislation to stop people visiting me so that I can be on my own. I have to say, you did make me smile there, Paul. Another Peter has said, Michelle, and he puts it in capitals, so I know you mean business. You say, please, will you move on? You're like a stuck record. Don't you guys mind, or the ones that this is relevant to, don't you guys mind what happened during the pandemic when you see videos of people, for example, at funerals that weren't allowed to comfort their loved ones, when you see people saying goodbye to their loved ones on an iPhone screen, etc. Don't you mind, now that you've heard that actually so much of this was based on absolute nonsense, don't you sit there and think to yourself, we should never, ever, ever, ever again be in that predicament? It blows my mind that so many people don't seem to mind about this, but get in touch with me. Give me your thoughts. Would you support a law like this? Or are you more of the camp which says, pack it in, Michelle, shut up, move on? It's currently dividing you. I want a petition to stop anyone treating people in care homes as they did during the lockdown. Inhumane does not go far enough to describe this atrocity, says Pat. John says, I wouldn't support a law because, as James says, we don't know what we would be dealing with when it comes to another pandemic. Well, keep your thoughts coming in. GBViews at gbnews.uk is how you can reach me tonight.